So thank you everyone who's joining us today. My name is Upasna Gupta and I run product marketing for Vast Data. Welcome to our deep dive Q&A session on Gemini. Gemini is our recently announced subscription-based licensing model that decouples the purchase process for hardware and software. But before we dive in, I would like to introduce you to our very special guests today. So Jeff, do you want to go and introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Jeff Denworth. I'm CMO, run products and marketing for Vast Data and a co-founder of the company.
Excellent. Matt.
Yeah, I'm Matt Robinson. I'm the CTO here at Rahi Systems, responsible for the global aspects of our technical delivery organization.
Matt, can you just tell our audience a little bit more about what Rahi does?
Yeah, sure. We're a global solutions provider. We enable customers in a variety of ways, anything from data center to cloud capabilities, primarily focused around business transformation solutions for these customers. That can entail a lot of things, and we'll talk about Elevate more later on in the presentation, but been here a couple of years. We handle tremendous amounts of enterprise capability for our customers, making sure that we accommodate all aspects of their business, whether that's, again, AV or data center or IT, even cloud. And we do software engineering and other implementations and customizations for very large scale enterprise customers.
Wonderful, and we're very grateful for your partnership, and we look forward to really working with you on a lot of initiatives. And I can tell you about Jeff. Jeff is a cool CMO. He's unlike other CMOs. He spends a lot of time with customers. So Jeff is the right person to answer all your questions related to Gemini. So now before we talk about Gemini, I'm pretty sure a lot of you might not be familiar with what Vast Data is and why Vast Data is becoming such a big deal with a lot of enterprise customers. So I just want to take a quick minute to introduce who we are. Our mission at Vast is very simple. We really want to bring an end to decades of storage complexity and trade-offs. Vast Data really frees you from the tyranny of tiers, as we like to call it, by unlocking the ability to use Flash for all your data across your enterprise. And how does Vast do it? It really makes it possible to store all of your data in a single tier of Flash storage by making it so affordable that it's fast enough for your most demanding applications. It's large enough to manage all of your data, and it's affordable enough so that you no longer have to use hard disk drives. Just imagine the possibilities when it's possible to just obscure your data from these tiers and silos, and you can actually unleash more powerful insights for your business. And we introduced Gemini in the same spirit of disruption, innovation, because we really wanted to give our customers more simplicity, more agility, more visibility and transparency with none of the risk and complexity that they've dealt with in the past. And with that, I'm going to first have Jeff quickly recap for our customers what Gemini is. We announced it earlier in April of this year, and how does it deliver value for our customers?
Tough act to follow when I have to be cool, but I'll see if I can make this cool. So, why did we feel that we needed to reinvent the storage consumption model? The story kind of goes back to one customer, and I'll tell you their story in a little bit, but the way that we were previously operating is kind of the way that the storage industry has been selling and customers have been consuming storage for the last few decades. And what we had was a selling motion that was really driven by hardware. Because every storage company has to answer to some gross profit model that's a function of how much they sell on top of the hardware costs. And here we found ourselves in an interesting situation because we sell a minimum unit that is 700 terabytes, which is a big byte for most customers. But on top of that, we were engaging in deals that today we're talking with a customer about selling an exabyte for just one system. And so, at the low end of the sales spectrum, our sales team was really having difficulty planting seeds within customer environments where customers didn't necessarily want 700 terabytes or need 700 terabytes to start. And so here, every deal was kind of fighting against that gross margin profile that we needed to work towards. And then on the high end of our deals, some of the customers are very good at buying exabytes of storage, and they're not going to pay kind of traditional enterprise storage gross margins. And so we asked ourselves the question, which is, what if we could decouple our selling motion from hardware? One customer in particular, they wanted full access to our supply chain, and they wanted complete visibility into what we were doing. And so we realized we can just give the keys to the castle to them. And what Gemini is ultimately a new business model where we give customers the ability to buy hardware at cost, and software is just a subscription that runs on top of an appliance. Now, what Gemini is not is free reign for customers to just deploy software on any hardware of their choosing. And the reason for that is that we wanted to maintain an enterprise experience with respect to how they deployed and how they kind of managed their storage infrastructures. And so that's why we say you can buy like a hyperscaler, because we give you all of the transparency and all of the levers from an economic perspective to look deeply into what the hardware costs are. And we're buying an aggregated, our customers are buying an aggregated amount of infrastructure, a single SKU that ultimately gets them to really good buying power. But at the same time, we preserve that enterprise experience where customers don't have to worry about things like support or integration. We handle all of that. And what's behind this is our concentration and our focus on QAing a very tightly integrated storage appliance that we have a lab that basically is about $30 million of hardware we've invested in to make it just a perfect deployment experience. And so Gemini is first basically providing customers more economic levers to get started and to grow with VAST. The second thing it is the ability to no longer kind of couple hardware to a storage company selling motion. And so here, the way that storage companies have gotten paid up until now is some salesperson comes in and sells you some new hardware so that they can get paid on software. Well, we said, why does it have to be like that? And so by getting out of the hardware business, customers can now decide on their refresh cycle, on their agenda. We have customers that want to refresh equipment every 2 years because maybe they're space constrained. We have other customers that want to keep equipment on the floor for 10 years. But what won't happen is you'll never have a salesperson run in and try to sell you hardware in advance of you actually needing that, because we're not compensated, we're not motivated by that anymore. And then there's a bunch of protections that we've instilled into the program, both from a commercial perspective. We pushed out this guarantee program we call the Zero Compromises Guarantee. And what zero compromises means is that we've taken all the risk out of buying universal storage. It's a set of protections that include comprehensive access to all of our software, protections against downtime, protections against even data reduction inefficiencies. And at the end of the day, it also provides a 90-day right to return for all of our customers. That's no questions asked. And so from a buying perspective, customers now have the protections that they need to make that investment. And then once they've made that investment, the final element of Gemini comes in, which is a program that we call Copilot. And copilots are essentially level 3 engineers that we're dedicating to all of our customers. We have the luxury of selling large systems to big customers that care about their data. And so copilots are basically cloud operators that work for our customers and handle everything from daily monitoring to capacity management to upgrades to expansions. All of this is done by copilots. So customers ultimately, A, have an expert alongside of them running their systems with them, but B, it just becomes easy to consume and deploy and scale up universal storage because all of that work is being handled by VAST. And we wanted something that was as simple as, or even simpler than a cloud experience. And I think we've achieved that with the investment that we're making. It's a no cost on our customers' behalf. And it's an investment that we make in copilots, basically with the bet that our customers are going to go big and the copilots will enable them to take that path.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. I like how you said we are essentially giving keys to the castle to our customers. And I love that we're learning from customer experience to make the product decisions and business related decisions. Before I pull in Matt, just a quick clarifying question, because I see that come up often. What does hardware at cost really mean for our customers?
So actually, we're not in the purchase path, which means that we're not putting any tax on the equipment, and our partners are sourcing this equipment directly from Avnet, who's sourcing it directly from the component suppliers. And so the value is in software, and customers now get complete visibility to at cost. And sometimes we say below cost. And what I mean there is that we have many customers that have been surprised when they see the actual cost of the equipment, of the buying power of the aggregated vast customer community, where if they were to go source the parts that that Avnet provides, they wouldn't be able to get those same prices, because what's behind Avnet is hundreds of petabytes of infrastructure, all in support of just one SKU that we support. So it's actually under cost.
Yeah, and I actually just maybe to riff off that for a second, Jeff, I think that that's where ultimately the industry is going to go, where they begin to recognize that bifurcation and split between, what hardware brings to the table and getting innovation through that cycle, and also recognizing that software is its own innovation cycle, and that by conjoining that too tightly and tightly coupling that, you actually lose some of the value that can come into play. You can get cost optimization on the hardware while taking advantage of the flexibility on the licensing side from the software end to help with the benefits.
Makes sense. I'm going to pull you in for another question, Matt. One thing I forgot to mention for our audience is there's a Q&A button. If you have questions, please submit your questions to the Q&A button, and I'll try to pull those in throughout the session or towards the end of the session. And with that, Matt, I think initially you mentioned that you've been helping customers to drive business transformation, or what we like to call as infrastructure modernization as well, especially as customers want to run their most storage and performance intensive applications, including AI and HPC, among others. When you work with customers to modernize their infrastructure, what are those commercial levers that customers are specifically asking for?
Yeah, there's quite a few, but maybe I'll just focus on a couple of them. The first is financial, right? The idea that business decisions is no longer just a relationship discussion. It really does involve looking at the financials and the impact that any kind of decision they're going to make to affect the long-term strategy of a business has to involve what is the cost, getting into even NPV conversations around those long-term investments. And we're seeing this shift. I think most companies have made it, but there's still some that are transitioning away from just purely a CapEx construct, unless you're a public utility, into more of an OpEx and service consumption model. And this idea that services is starting to take over the mindset of how people look at consumption, that it's about the licensing of whatever something somebody needs for the consumption unit, and when they don't need it, they have the ability to potentially turn it down or turn it off. That is a common mindset. So it's coming to build a common pattern in the budgeting process for companies. We're also seeing a shift towards cloud, and by cloud I don't necessarily mean public cloud. What I mean is the idea that cloud gives the company itself a chance to think about how services are ultimately deployed, so that if you're a company and you're looking to roll out some sort of software application, your own platform into an ecosystem, a lot of times they look to maybe quickly innovate through a public cloud strategy, but long term, they want to move more into running the infrastructure themselves, because at scale, the cost efficiencies that can be gained by running your own privatized infrastructure, where you control the amount of infrastructure needed to run that service, and you can tune your software to run on top of that, that can be very advantageous. There's a number of reports out there, and maybe Jeff's got one or two he can talk to in a minute. But the idea that as a starting point, it's great to get out of the gate with renting somebody else's infrastructure. But long term, if you want to have some form of understanding of your profitability and controlling the margins, you're going to want to basically build your own cloud platform for the SaaS that you're offering. SaaS is definitely the area where we're seeing that model. And I think the other lever, that's probably critical of the top three is the idea of headcount. And it's not just pandemic related, but the ability to bring on resources and have them ready to go with the technologies that are on the floor today and evolving to in the future. It can be very complex because you're investing a lot into these resources. You want them to continue to manage and control these environments, but they can't necessarily take everything that's on the floor today and become experts in it. And so building better operational simplicity into the platforms and maximizing the value of your headcount for that kind of work can be immensely critical. So the more you can take off of the people on site and put into, for example, a co-pilot type model, it's far more advantageous for them in the long run.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think one of the things that you just mentioned about that movement back to on-premises, that really resonates with me a lot. Having worked at AWS before this, customers are fast realizing what the long-term cost implication of cloud is. And there's this trend where they feel that it's better to run some of their workloads on premises from a technological standpoint, but also from a cost standpoint. So I think that really resonates with me. I do want to, Jeff, this is more for you. I do want to dive into some of the aspects that we talked about Gemini when it comes to, especially when it comes to shifting the narrative for our customers in terms of giving them more control over the economics of their investments. We want to talk about the refresh and the maintenance cycle as well, which has been a big problem for our customers in the past. But before we do that, how does licensing really work with Gemini? It's a common question that we get. How do customers source their hardware? How do they subscribe to Gemini software licenses? Can you talk our customers more through that process?
Sure. So, if you think about what's being offered, we start with certifying a collection of hardware technologies that we take out to market with Avnet. And there we get deployment predictability. And so customers, when they look at a quote, they'll see a storage enclosure with a bunch of flash in it. They'll see some switches and they'll see some servers, and that basically becomes their hardware SKU. And as I mentioned, we have a few tens of millions of dollars of investment associated with making this work like a top. And it really is delivering extremely high levels of uptime, predictability, and supportability within the field. Now, software comes on, as Matt was referencing, is kind of an incremental layer that customers subscribe to according to what they're trying to accomplish, right? And so you can source as little as 100 terabyte license if you want to just start small, and then it's a monthly SKU which runs out, or it's a monthly cost which runs out to however long you'd like to be a Gemini subscriber. And so this 100 terabytes can consume all of the usable capacity of an enclosure. If you go up to 600 terabytes, that's the usable space of an enclosure. And then you can go across all of the different enclosures that you've deployed. And so customers don't have to license all of the hardware that they've deployed within a cluster. It's basically a function of what are your current free space requirements. And the nice thing about the software is it can transfer. It's transferable to any other hardware platform that you may deploy. And so it just becomes this service that runs on top of hardware that we know and trust. And the objective here is to build a platform that has what we call an infinite life cycle, because hardware doesn't need to ever be migrated to and from. You just add hardware to the system as you want to grow it. The software is essentially abstracted away from any of the commercials or deployment aspects of the hardware. And as customers grow, they can just move their infrastructure to different hardware generations. The system lives on without requiring customers to do anything like go and migrate data to any other platform. And that's part of the value that we bring to the table at the architecture level is what we call an asymmetric architecture. And Gemini becomes this kind of nice thing that sits on top of it, where we're completely disaggregated from the hardware business, such that you don't have to make decisions on buying hardware related to your previous software investments. They're completely independent.
That makes a lot of sense. One quick question that I see from the chat is,
Sure.
Is the capacity licensing usable or not raw?
Usable before data reduction. So that's always a variable that we don't want customers to have to wrestle with after they've made their purchase. So we know what the overhead of the system is, and we just basically license by usable capacity.
Okay.
Yeah, and clearly the goal in that kind of architecture is to maximize the capabilities of that reduction so that they get more long-term value for that. That's really the intention.
Of course.
Jeff, can you also share a few examples of customers that have subscribed to Gemini? What was the motivation? What was the use case? What kind of savings did they experience? Because I think it'll help them understand the licensing a little bit better.
Sure. So a few weeks ago, we had a webinar where we introduced this concept. One of the customers that was on the webinar is a financial services organization called SquarePoint. They previously came out of Barclays. It was the systematic trading team at Barclays. And SquarePoint approached us with kind of a challenge, I would say. and was some of the early evidence of what we were making and with this new Gemini program and why it has real value. They approached us and they said they need gobs of performance, much more than what any one unit would provide them from VAST, and they wanted to build a very large cluster, but they didn't need all the capacity that would come associated with that initial investment. So what Gemini allowed them to do is essentially license half the capacity, which resulted in a 7-figure level of savings from their purchase. And if at some point in the future they need capacity, it becomes really easy to just increment additionally, and they don't have to deploy any more hardware. So they bought the hardware at cost. It was minimal, and they saved a bunch of money by not over investing in something that they didn't need out of the gate. Now, another customer that we work with, I referenced earlier, there was a company that originally planted the seed. It's a very large hyperscale customer. And this is an organization that actually likes to align their storage purchasing schedule with their server purchasing schedule. Why is that? Because they have really tight relationships with organizations like NVIDIA and like Intel. And so by bringing a more accumulated amount of business to the table helps them with their commercial agenda. And so now that they have complete visibility into the mechanics of our hardware and the economics of it, they're able to go and add that to the discussion that they have with Intel when it comes time to negotiate. Now, the third example is one that actually came from a study that ESG did, where they determined after talking to a few customers that the average savings that you make through this new approach ranges anywhere between 40% to 70% versus the classic way of consuming infrastructure. And we'll point you to that report as a takeaway from this call. But those are actually, there's one other example that's very topical. We're working with a customer today that is kind of pinched with the supply chain shortage that's going on globally. And so they want to basically pre-buy all the hardware that they expect to deploy over the next couple of months just to kind of lock in access to that equipment. But they don't need all of the capacity to start. And so what they're doing is they're basically going out and buying around 50 petabytes of infrastructure. They may license about 20 petabytes to start, which is great for them. So they love the concept, just provides more flexibility with them as they kind of do their capacity planning.
That makes a lot of sense. I think I want to switch gears a little bit, and then we've touched upon this topic a little bit, and I want to bring back into this discussion. There are a lot of challenges that customers face today when it comes to refresh cycles. I think, Jeff, you touched upon that. Matt, you touched upon that. But let's talk a little bit in some more detail what those forced refreshes look like, what that maintenance extortion looks like. As you work with your customers, what are the biggest challenges that they're struggling with as they work with the traditional vendors today? Can you share a few examples?
I certainly can. Just thinking through one customer I'm working with right now, we're having to do a forward projection of up to 2 years based upon not just the amount of storage they have, but the ability for them to get it off of their existing platforms into the new platforms. And even though concepts like migrations that aren't going to impact the user from a front end protocol perspective are out there today, that doesn't necessarily mean that the operational processes for that company allow for them to just move things arbitrarily without change controls, without executive buy-in, and also with data center leases expiring. We see these things affecting companies in dramatic and ways that they have to do lots of planning for. But then when you inject a 3 to 5 year refresh or renewal cycle into that process, you're not really building sustainability into how the person's thinking about their infrastructure and how it needs to continually operate, from day one to day, whatever you decide to turn that box off as part of the environment. So these kind of planning cycles for this one company I'm thinking of, we're currently having to project out well into the future for what they need. And they're having to look at decisions now around, oh my gosh, do I refresh this? Do I renew it? What kind of platform do I need to select? And that's a real challenge for them because they just don't operate in that frequent of a mindset. They want to put the data in, they want it to execute, and they want this to cycle out whenever they feel it's necessary based upon how they run their business. not based upon necessarily what the vendor is forcing them to comply with. We're also seeing, particularly to our business in terms of some of the global support that we provide to some of these, again, very large, almost hyperscaler-like companies. This pandemic behavior has also created problems where even, for example, getting into certain areas and ecosystems to modify and change technology out is not something that they can do rapidly. And when somebody comes and says, hey, next year I need you to refresh all of your hardware, they're thinking, well, that doesn't work well in my model. Like, that doesn't help support the way in which I want to run my business. You're now putting your business model on top of me, forcing me to comply with that construct. And so I think we're seeing that the way in which companies want to operate and the way in which they think about things just continually running almost nonstop in terms of their operational models. They want that principle in place, but they don't want to dictate it because somebody says the hardware has to be cycled out, or we need to make a change in your environment that frankly doesn't work well with how you're operating your business.
Yeah, and Jeff, I think practically that makes a lot of sense. But the only thing maybe you can help our customers understand is there's another implication associated with it. Like, even if there is not a forced hardware refresh imposed by vendors, how do you really handle new capabilities that are not supported by older generations? You talked about asymmetric architecture, but really, if a cluster was instantiated with older servers and it does not support these newer functions, how do our customers think about adding new servers? How do our customers think about extending Gemini subscription across different types of hardware?
Sure. Yeah, I was thinking, Matt, when we've been working with Rahi a lot lately, and the team likes to use this term, sweat the assets.
Yeah.
And that's like a good thing, right? It's kind of contradictory to the kind of phrase like, don't sweat it. When you're sweating something, it's usually pretty bad. But in the case of infrastructure, you want to kind of sweat it out as much as you can. And the way that I look at it is people equally sweat, but in a bad way, maintenance renewals, because what happens is the vendors start to kind of jack up the prices to essentially encourage an equipment refresh, which drives more software sales for them. And so by being independent of that, it's interesting. But this equally applies to the scaling model, right? So, Upasna, to your question, so understand that we have this disaggregated architecture. CPUs that are all stateless basically drive the system, and your data is all organized into a set of very high density, highly available storage enclosures. And the logic of the system, it doesn't work or act and perform functions in terms of enclosures or drives. Everything is completely thin provisioned across a namespace that can scale to exabytes. And so as you add new equipment, it just becomes incremental to the overall cluster capacity. As you add more cores, it just becomes more increments of computing power that you add into the system. And for example, if you add a new generation of hardware, the nice thing about flash is that performance and capacity tend to scale on a linear curve. And so next year, when we have PCI Gen 4 systems out, they're not only going to be twice as fast, but they're also going to be twice as dense as what we have today. And it preserves this very nice balance. We already have customers that have deployed multiple generations of hardware into a single cluster. And that same principle is also applicative to the compute layer, the cores of the system. Next year, if we deploy a new server to drive our containers that has twice the number of cores, that server will just get allocated twice the amount of load versus the older servers, so that you can keep and maintain that balance and get good infrastructure investment. And so the really nice thing about this is as we increment additional capabilities in software, some of this does require computing power. For example, a simple example is encryption. And this is the first architecture where you can just add CPUs to your heart's content to keep a level of performance without having to buy any more storage. And so there's all sorts of these nice technical advantages that roll up equally to a business advantage when it comes to being decoupled from the actual the hardware business on our behalf, right? So customers can just keep hardware on the floor, and they can keep extending Gemini support for that hardware. And as it gets old enough and they ultimately want to age it out because it's done sweating, it's really easy to do that as well.
You know, Jeff, I used to think of, I don't think I'm dating myself too much, but it used to be in Hadoop clusters, right? You would just start adding nodes.
Oh,
and
that's a
people
very antiquated reference.
Yeah, not going back to, let's say, the early 90s with Silicon Graphics, but we'll keep it in Hadoop terminologies. But people would just basically add nodes to their Hadoop cluster, and with it, you got a fixed amount of CPU, you got a certain amount of storage. But what would happen is the curve would change. So the idea is I actually need to process more data rather than I need more capacity. But as that expansion occurred over time, the larger your cluster got, the more the gap was in place, and the more, let's say, servers you had to buy, even though you weren't able to use the CPU, you needed it for storage reasons, or you needed more CPUs and you just had all this excess storage that you weren't really taking advantage of. So cost-wise, at scale, it became, very unattractive to run these large-scale systems, because, to your point, they really weren't disaggregated. Where if I need CPU to process NFS v3, S3, any kind of fabric-based solution, I want that CPU power to do that. And frankly, to be able to take advantage of newer platforms that come out to give me more capability there over time and simply extend my cluster capability. Similarly, on the storage end, looking at, Optane plus QLC, this idea that I can expand that as I need to and continue to use and grow that based upon my capacity requirements and just apply software license on top of that is, again, very attractive. It gives the right kind of knobs rather than, previously where that tight coupling created a real dilemma in terms of the business decisions. Because now when I'm getting a request to hey, come buy this amount of storage, it's already coming with everything packaged together, which can be very difficult if they feel like I'm having to over purchase in order to accommodate an architecture that doesn't really accommodate this kind of separation.
And there's some happy surprises too, right? We have this customer, they have about I would say a 20 petabyte system, and they had very few servers on top of it. And so they approached us and they're like, wow, we're probably going to buy this other high performance file system for these other requirements. And it was one of our first Gemini deals. And I was like, why are you going to do that? Just buy some CPUs and create it into a different pool. You've got dedicated performance. The underlying flash already can give you way more than what you're using. And so the sales team goes and kind of works with the customer on a quote. And there was no software. There was just cores, right? And so they didn't know what to do. And we were just like, just let it happen. And the customer avoided buying a whole other storage cluster, because what they didn't realize is that they had so much untapped performance from a flash perspective in the system. They could easily just go and provision with just a little bit more compute.
Yep. I love how we live up to our tagline of no more trade-offs, no more business trade-offs, no more architectural trade-offs. And this is what, by the way, this is what I meant when I said our CMO is unique and different. He spends so much time with our customers working on the architecture and helping them understand how it really drives value. I think it brings a really unique perspective for our customers. I do want to switch gears here because we have a bunch of topics, and I've seen this question come up often, and it's in the chat as well. If we've decoupled hardware and software, and you've touched upon this, but still help our customers understand, Jeff, who handles the hardware support? Who handles the support? Who is that throat to choke if something goes wrong?
I had like a off the camera kind of thing going on. It's us. So we handle 100% of the support experience. Avnet will ship out equipment if you need any replacement parts, but we're the Slack channel you dial into when there's anything that's happening. We receive all of the telemetry of all the systems that are being deployed with 5-minute frequency. So we know what's going on across our whole fleet of systems that we've deployed across the field. And oftentimes we know of issues that are happening even before customers do. And so what customers are really telling us is that one of the reasons that they're not just investing, but they're aggressively investing in VAST is because our support experience is just so far superior to where they've come from when dealing with legacy equipment providers that are kind of like sunsetting the kind of popularity of their products. And so we didn't want to change that at all, right? With Gemini, we looked at it and said, yeah, we might be out of the hardware business, but the customers still need an absolute perfect experience. And so we handle everything.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And I will just add, in my first couple of weeks, I was very fortunate that I got to be a part of a customer call. And one quote that still is with me is that BaaS support is light years ahead of the other vendors out there. When they had to work with their previous vendor, they said it was like pulling their teeth. And now they can, that their support, their co-pilot, Dima, and I love the fact that they have this first name relationship. They can quickly call that person and it's solved even before they know it. Like the time to resolve bugs, the time to resolve their issues is so lightning fast that our customers love the architecture, but our customers just simply love the support experience as well. So it's really good to hear that from your perspective as well. And Matt, I don't know if you want to chime in here, because I know you work with a lot of customers as well, and I think support can be a nightmare for a lot of customers. Do you have any comments, or do you have any quotes that you often hear from your customers?
Yeah, I think it's probably one of the most the interesting challenges, and we can get into a whole another hour-long conversation on, you know, the concept of supporting enterprise customers, because the needs vary tremendously. So in essence, the more straightforward and capable your support organization is in terms of the level of support that it provides, not just in terms of how quickly they answer the calls, but the comprehensive nature of which they can provide a response and both deal with the issue in a resolution time that really hits some of the SLAs. That's absolutely key, and I think VAST is taking a lead on that, you know, and conjoined with some things that we do at Rahi. We provide, for example, NOC support and a number of other things. So it gives us the ability to not just look at partnership through the VAST experience, but also how we support the SLAs that customers are trying to hit. Because at the end of the day, they're supporting their customers, their businesses, and we need to be equally as responsive. But just in terms of horror stories, we could probably, again, spend a long time talking about all of the ones that are out there from a support context, not in a bad or negative way, but certainly in sort of creative scenarios I'm sure we've all seen.
Maybe we can talk just a little bit about that if you feel comfortable, especially because, you know, we know that this software-defined subscription model works, and a lot of vendors have tried to implement it in the past. Maybe not from a support perspective, but when customers have tried to do this in the past, what have been some of the biggest shortcomings in your experience?
Yeah, so if I'm thinking through software-defined support, so thinking about it through, you know, taking let's say, for example, a storage platform and trying to offer it in a software aggregated solution packaged on top of some, let's say, commoditized hardware, it's a real challenge. And for the most part, the legacy storage providers struggle because they've built these qualification systems and they built these mechanisms where they have to make sure that all of the things that you put into that platform have to be tuned to such a nuanced level that you might as well just be going back to the original vendor to get the hardware that you need, which again creates that lock-in mentality and that lock-in construct. And additionally, you know, they've built and tuned to accommodate, for example, older architectures. The software that they've implemented, you know, may have, for example, tuning specific to using hard disks. You know, remember a lot of these companies started with spinning media and don't have the advantages that the VAST has in terms of leveraging SSD and even, you know, non-volatile memory capabilities day one. So because of that, you end up with these compromises that ultimately existing because, you know, either the hardware is limited in terms of what you can actually go get, or the software's been crippled because it can't fully take advantage of what you're putting underneath. And so they're having to now do things in software that are, you know, very unorthodox as far as how you might expect a storage system to work, which is, again, to focus on protocol in one area and focus on the speed of the media underneath. So I think a lot of the software-defined models that are out there today have really been, you know, hamstrung, if you would, by this inability to take advantage of the hardware in a more flexible way, and in a more dynamic way. And you know, I think it's an area that VAST certainly has a leg up. If I want to use hamstring as an analogy, they have a leg up on as far as the business is concerned.
Yeah. Jeff, I know you've spoken about the architecture already and how it really solves the challenges that Matt just outlined. Do you want to share any other comments before we kind of move into our next section?
No, Matt, you got a job at VAST if Rahi doesn't work out.
Yeah, it's you know, so being a technologist, Jeff, I like the idea of looking forward. I see, for example, things like containers becoming foundational to the way in which people look at platform support. It's something obviously that VAST is doing as part of their architecture. Noting that, there's a consumption model construct that's in place. And while people think of COTS as, one mechanism to do that from a deployment perspective, ultimately customers want flexibility. They want the ability to decide on their own what to use. And if I think about this move in a lot of cases towards a repatriation concept where we're beginning to see the democratization and balancing of what does it mean to run in a cloud, you're not really getting any advantage. And at some point, the prices are going to become a fixed asset and a fixed commodity that you're going to use within cloud. How do you get those additional cost advantages? We see that ultimately coming back. So you can use your relationships to create better hardware pricing and get your software to use on top of that for whatever you want to consume. So I think there's a lot of places. Sorry, go ahead.
NVIDIA uses a term which is, they call it buy the base and rent the spike. And, the whole kind of notion of where's the best place to deploy infrastructure, I think it comes down to planning and predictability, right? And if you can plan, if your applications are mature, if your workloads are mature, you kind of know what you're going to get. And, I'll try to put on my cool hat now and invoke Andreessen Horowitz, where they just published this whole paper about how the paradox of the cloud is that companies need to jumpstart really quickly, so it's a great place to work. But then when they get to maturity, cloud becomes an inhibitor just because of the overall costs. And Matt, earlier you were talking about resources and people and why Gemini helps. And it's funny, I was talking to a CIO the other day, and he said, well, time is money, and I need to kind of like move really quickly. And so, people are my most finite resource, and the cloud solves that problem. And I countered and I said, money's also money. And there's just a real cost associated with this stuff. And I think it's cool to watch the industry now actually have the conversation. And I think Andreessen gets some credit for stirring the pot a little bit.
Yeah, and not only that, I think about the idea of, the way I described it is, what is your initial, time to value, time to revenue. People look at cloud in that concept, but when we talk about time to long-term profitability, we think about taking away that instant gratification feel and getting more into the idea of, well, now money is money, and how do I run a business, and how do I ensure that I'm set up and prepared to run for the long term. That's where I think away from the smaller company into the big company to the enterprise, where they're now beginning to have to tackle these problems. I also think that the technology, and again, this is where I think VAST is taking a lead, is more, I hate to say cloud ready, but think of it through this, because it's such a overused term. I think cloud ready through the concept of how you run and execute your business and simplifying the operational model. That's actually more valuable than just about everything else. If I go back 10 years, when people really started looking to swipe credit cards and move to a cloud provider, it's because they couldn't get things fast enough. There was one oil and gas company I was working with where the amount of time to get a VM based upon physical asset deployment in the environment was on the order of 2 months. But to actually provision a virtual asset within the same business on the same virtual infrastructure was only 3 days less. So the actual operational processes and the way the business would operate and the impediments they would put upon themselves was huge. And so people started to get tired of it. They said, look, I can go faster this way. But now, with the simplicity, with the ability to roll these things out, the decision making around that time to value can start to pivot back, because you don't have the same types of complexities that maybe you had in architectures where you just had 12 different vendors sitting on the floor and you're trying to rationalize as an IT organization how to deal with all of that. So I think we're again starting to see that pendulum swing in a direction where the decision making, initially they talk about hybrid, but I do think that there's going to be a lot of cases where for many companies, to the Andreessen Horowitz article, they're going to see a better need to run on-prem for overall value to the business.
Yeah, and I think where VAST really delivers value is you still get the same benefits of simplicity and agility that you get on the cloud, but with none of those long-term cost implications. And also, not every company really is a hyperscaler, or not every company wants to be at that scale. But what ultimately they want is They want access to those tools, to those resources, to that buying capability, which these hyperscalers have enjoyed in the past, and which hasn't always been accessible to a lot of our customers. So I think there's definitely a lot of value that Gemini brings without necessarily having cloud as the only answer to,
Right.
to challenges that customers are trying to solve. So in the same way, go ahead.
I would just add, there's a footnote to that statement about the same levels of simplicity, right? If I go to a modern cloud platform, and we studied this really hard when we started the company. It's like, well, how can we be competitive in the cloud era? And I wrestled with the decision to go to a storage company for that very reason. And then when we looked at it, what we observed is that every cloud platform is just respinning old storage concepts back to customers in the form of a service. And so I would argue it's simpler from the perspective of VAST, because now customers don't have to choose about they don't have to devalue their data by buying different tiers of infrastructure. And so it's just a much more simpler data and application experience when you have this big flash cloud that you can deploy all your applications on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I would actually peel back my ITSM.
Yeah, that's an antiquated reference.
Yeah, if I go back, if I pull out my ITIL, I'm going to say that capacity planning is something that whether you're a cloud provider, whether you're on-prem business, it's something that you have to deal with at scale. What's nice about looking at a VAST solution, where again, that disaggregation can help you, is you can actually plan better based upon the types of things that you need in the business. Even to your point earlier about buying infrastructure in advance, putting it in place and being able to expand and grow into it as you see that need, so that you're not impacted by supply chain scenarios. Those are great flexibilities that, previously, even taking refresh and renewal into the equation, these are hard decisions that a business had to make. And they then had to sometimes make bad decisions from a purchase perspective, just to be able to accommodate dealing with that capacity planning problem. And I think that the simplification is much better than, say, what we were 5-10 years ago in that concept. And I think, VAST gives that flexibility on, if I need more storage, I know what I need to go get. If I need more protocol processing capability, I know what I need to go get. And at the end of the day, you have somebody that's sitting there looking at that entire environment, giving you the insights to know, hey, from a Copilot perspective, this is what we see, and this is going to help you plan out better. So it's that partnership that allows you to be successful and takes that whole capacity planning problem off the table compared to what you may have had to deal with, certainly 5 years ago, but definitely as far as like 10 years ago.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And I think as we're getting closer to the end of this session, I really want to at least give our customers a way to get started with VAST. And I think Rahi can bring a lot of value and help there. So Matt, how do you think, what would you recommend to our customers? How do they get started with VAST? How do they get started with Rahi to bring in this next phase of infrastructure modernization?
So the way in which we work with our customers is to approach them with the program and a methodology we call Elevate. Elevate is our way of working with a customer to understand where are you at today and ultimately where are you trying to go. So thinking through that business transformation, digital transformation concept. And really it is about understanding just what are the business, what are the financial and the technical levers that you need to work with as a customer to better affect where you're ultimately trying to get to. And so we have a methodology that starts with assessing where a customer's at today. Ultimately, what do you need in terms of your environment, in terms of looking at those three levers. We then work with them to build out a plan to make sure that, for example, migrating into a VAST solution is not as a disruptive element to what's happening with the business, to make sure that the impact that they see within their ecosystem is not going to affect how they operate, that ultimately the performance is there, that the risk is removed or certainly lessened to a greater degree, and that the level of business continuity and other elements are accommodated for. We build those plans to make sure that we cover the architecture, the implementation, the operational model in conjunction and specifically with VAST with the Copilot model. We then go into, from assess to plan, we go into implement. That's where we actually help the customer go through that implementation, that migration. Sometimes it's simply just moving data from one location to another and then building that infinite model out that they need to have in place. Sometimes it's also code refactoring. Say a customer wants to move away from an older storage protocol mechanisms, they want to move to something that VAST supports. We can provide that as part of the implementation effort. And then long term, we have managed services where we can bring a NOC or staff aug or any number of resources to help accommodate. So in partnership with VAST, we like to come in and understand where a customer's at, where they're trying to get to, and how they can achieve their business goals, knowing that the underlying platform can help them build out, for example, their own cloud capability and their own cloud services within their organization, and they can improve their margins, reduce their risk, overall provide better time to value to their customers. And Elevate is a consistent way in which we do that. And whether we start with an assessment, sometimes we come in later when we're doing plans or implementations, ultimately it's that partnership goal, the symbiosis with VAST on storage solutions that we think will be very effective to what we implement.
Okay, that's super helpful, and I love how comprehensive this program is. And I think a lot of these Q&As, I'm sure they helped customers understand what value Gemini and VAST can bring for these customers, and how Rahi is an enabler in this journey. As we wrap up this session, I think I just want to quickly recap the key takeaways that at least I took from having experts like you talk to our customers. That number one, with Gemini, with VAST, you get this enterprise-grade turnkey integrated appliance that is completely managed and fully supported by VAST, which I think is a huge value proposition because it takes away all the risk and the complexity. I think the other part that we continued to talk about is, hey, get more visibility, get more control over the economics of your long-term investment. Like Matt, you said, take back control over what your hardware purchase and refresh cycle looks like. The customer is in the decision-making seat rather than the vendors, the storage vendors. And I just love the fact that customers get more simplicity, like Jeff mentioned, and the flexibility and the tools that were previously only available and accessible to hyperscale companies. And what I would really do at this point is thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Matt, for coming here. Thank our audience for joining us. What I want our audience to do is we're going to show you, and we're going to put in a link here with one of our newest customer stories, Jump Trading. Jump Trading is a fantastic story. They are a trading firm, huge trading firm with over 20 global offices in EMEA, Asia, and United States. And they made the jump to VAST data and saw a huge competitive advantage. They've been able to give access to vast amount of data to their researchers, and just enable better training and trading models, which really can be the clinching difference between massive profits and in the other direction losses. So do check out the Jump Trading story that we recently published in Protocol. And here are some helpful links. If you want to learn more about Gemini, visit our homepage. There's a TCO calculator, by the way, which we'll drop in the chat and we'll share via email as well. You can see how you compare to other vendors when you use VAST for your storage needs. And here is a link to the Elevate program that Matt just mentioned about. And as usual, if you have any questions, feel free to contact us. Feel free to reach out to any of the experts, and we'll follow up via email with these resources and with any other information that you need.